Well, hey, yo, Hugh Halter here. Hey guys, how's it going? Glad to be with you for another 4 months as we go through the book of Timothy. Man, I'm fired up. I literally have just been meditating on this the last couple weeks as just been thinking this through, and I've got my guys locally here ready to go. So we're gonna take a bunch of guys here in Alton through this as we kind of walk you guys through this fantastic book. This is, maybe, out of all the scripture that's written, like if you go like, is there a men's book that's in there? It's probably First and Second Timothy. The entire Bible is kind of written in a patriarchal sense. Women were not mentioned very much, and just culturally, they were not taken into consideration, and so a lot of the lingo is always, men to men. But this is probably the one book that you go, this is really a man's book. He's addressing, issues of the heart and the mind and the life of a man. So I'm very excited to go through this with you guys. The main theme, as we think about the entire book, it's stated there in the first chapter that Timothy, we would have a pure heart, a clear conscience, and a sincere faith. Okay, it's going to be a running theme throughout, that we'd be the type of men that would have a pure heart, clear conscience, sincere faith. And you go, impossible. I think it's actually very doable. And I think as we go through it, you're going to feel more and more hope for not only what Jesus has done for you and how that frees your life up, but what we can do in response to that. Strap it on. This is going to be good. I'm going to actually just get right into the scripture here, but just a little reminder, a little backdrop of this whole thing is that this is a letter that's written from an older guy, Paul, to a young guy, Timothy. And we think Timothy's mid-20s, maybe even up to 30. And you'll notice that Paul, everywhere he goes, he gets kind of hung up. He's either in jail or he's getting, his backside handed to him by some dudes. He can't seem to be present with all these communities that he started. And so he over and over will say, hey, I'm going to send Timothy to you, or just a little bit, Timothy's coming by. But it seems like Timothy is that one guy that Paul just goes, it doesn't matter what room is going to be full of people. I just want you to have Timothy in the room. Somehow he makes every place a little bit more stable. He brings a little bit of leadership. He brings some stability and just a presence that gives you guys confidence to keep going. So there's something about Timothy in this that we'll figure it out later. But there's also something about Paul, that Paul always had a young guy on his hip. And it's something to keep in mind as we get started. It's not too late to invite some young men with you. This is maybe what the movement of Christianity is based on, is that we pass the story down to younger and younger men and women, and that they get the story to the next thing. And so this is something unique about Paul, is that Paul was radically saved by Jesus, and it changed his life to the point where there was an invitation to be with Jesus, and very high challenge. I don't know if you guys remember, but I think the very first retreat that I did with you guys, I shared a grid that was written by a guy named Mike Breen that had talked about discipling culture. And he talked about in literally any discipline, if you're leading a company or a business, if you're leading a neighborhood community or a church, whatever it is, if you're trying to disciple young men that are your sons, trying to create some characteristic of your family that's positive and successful, he says in every scenario, take your cues from Jesus, who had what we call high invitation and high challenge. If you want to, maybe draw a square on your paper. I might even include this in your handouts, but at the very top of the square, put high invitation, and at the bottom of it, put low invitation. Then off to the right side, put high challenge, and then on the left side of the box, put low challenge. And so if you have essentially, like we say, a high challenge but low invitation, that's a stressful, discouraging. That's like getting a job at a big corporation, and the head boss hires you And so he gives you a high challenge, but low imitation. He's not with you. And so he just gives you numbers to hit. And so it'll cause you to be stressful and discouraged. In a church setting, high challenge, low invitation would be like a legalistic environment where you're told to do all these perfect things. And if you don't do it, then you suck. That would be a high challenge, low invitation. If you had a low invitation, low challenge, that would be what we call a bored or apathetic scenario. So nobody's doing anything, nobody's calling you to anything, nobody's really doing it. And so, you're just going to be bored and apathetic. If you have a high invitation, low challenge, in other words, hey, come, let's do this thing, but it's not really a big responsibility. You're going to have what we call a cozy culture. So it's just going to be you and yourself, or you and 4 men that you're with for the next 10 years in a Bible study group. That would be a high invitation, low challenge. And so none of those are what we're after in men's fraternity. None of those have been modeled by the men that have come before you. What's always kind of been put before us is what Paul's doing with Timothy right now. It's a high invitation, high challenge. Jesus, great example, would be where he says, hey, come follow me. That's high invitation. And it's not just that he's inviting lots of people. High invitation means that he's saying, come be with me personally. And so when Jesus told those guys, drop your nets, and they started to follow him, they were following him because he was going to be there with them. And then the high challenge was, and I will make you fishers of men. Get that? High invitation, high challenge. Come follow me. I will make you fishers of men. That's what we're really shooting for. Is not goofing around. It would seem silly that we would all keep getting up early and even showing up at church or trying to stay connected to some church if there wasn't a reason for it that actually can make a difference. We actually believe that the story of Jesus does make a radical difference. And so what we're getting here between Paul and Timothy is Paul's saying, look, I need you to step up, bro. And just like Tyler was sharing a story about what the coach said, here we have this other moment. So I'm just going to start reading. This is in verse 18. We're going to go through verse 20. And it's entitled, they didn't put these titles in the Bible back then, but people that are interpreting this said, they put at the top, Paul encourages Timothy to remain faithful. So Timothy, my son, I'm entrusting you with this very responsibility. There's the high challenge. In keeping with the very first prophecies that were spoken over your life and are now in the process of fulfillment in this great work of ministry, in keeping with the prophecies spoken over you. So he brings it up twice. With this encouragement, use your prophecies as weapons as you wage spiritual warfare by faith and with a clean conscience. So what's he saying? Really simply is that Paul is going, look, don't forget what was said about you. What I'm going to ask you to be doing for these churches and to take leadership, you probably are not going to feel confident unless you remember the things that were spoken on you. In other books of the New Testament, we see stories where others were laying hands on Timothy and praying over him, and that's probably where the prophecies were given. Don't think weird things when you hear the word prophecy. Prophecies are always reminders. In the Old Testament, he would send prophets, and they just remind God's people of what God had promised to do. Prophetic words over our lives are oftentimes, if somebody said something like Tyler's coach made a comment to him, they're reminding us of our identity and our potential and what God can do with us. And by the way, just a note, Tyler's word was so good last week to not look in the rearview mirror, that when you follow Jesus and you give your life to him, it says he always leads us in triumphal procession. Okay, so the Lord never drags you back through the mud. That's just not the direction he goes. And he never keeps his finger in your chest and keeps belittling you over past mistakes or whatever. The point of the gospel is that he just says, hey, don't look back anymore. We're constantly going forward. That was such a great word. And here Paul is saying to Timothy, don't forget the prophetic words over you. Now, why would that happen? Well, if you forget the call forward, you oftentimes think about how you're feeling right now or what you've been doing, and you just get mired in the mess of your apathy, maybe the mess of your sin, maybe the continual sins you just can't get over. And so if you don't remember the call forward, it's going to be very hard for you to actually be a responsible element. And that's what's unique about the Christian faith, is that we're not only people that celebrate and applaud what Jesus did for us. The point of it is it's a baton handoff. It's we're trying to bring the kingdom to bear all over the world, and Hugh, you need to get in the game. Here's the baton. So keep going, and then pass that baton to a couple guys beneath you. And so the issue of responsibility is unique to our Christian faith, is that in many other faiths, there's no particular responsibility. There's just an internal sort of like, grow closer to the way that you view God. But it doesn't have with it a responsibility to care for the world, or to care for the poor, or to care for the lost, or to care for creation. There's all sorts of responsibilities that are very unique to the call of Jesus. That's why it's a high bar. And the only way that you're going to stay sort of in that game, because it costs more of us, is if you remember the things that were spoken over you. If Tyler shared what his coach said, I remember, a security guard in Eastern Bloc Europe reading my last name, and he goes, "Halter." And I was like, "Yes, sir." He's like, "The ones who lift." And I was so intrigued by it, I asked him, "What do you mean, the ones who lift?" And he began to just say, "That's what your name means. It's the ones who carry weight." And I've had a few prophetic words from people over my life, and they always mentioned that I would carry the weight on my shoulders of people. If you ask my wife what's unique about Hugh, she would generally go, he's like I've heard her say it, he's the hardest working person. And he carries the weight of our community, or he carries the weight of our family. He always carries the weight of mission. That's just always been what I've done. I've never really wanted to. It's just that there's always been a vacuum of leadership. And so I think I've just intuitively went, well, if there's nothing moving, let's get it moving. I'm what's called a reluctant leader. I'm not looking for leadership. But there seems to be so little leadership in the world that sometimes, maybe if you're like me, you just go, I can't take it anymore, I'm going to step up. So those are some things that were said about me. I also remember a very poignant time where I got kicked out of a counseling program by an ex-pastor of mine that said, "Halter, you are not a counselor." And I was like, "Well, what am I?" And he just said, "You're an evangelist." I'd never had anybody say that to me. And that caught my attention. I'd never known what that was, and so I started to study what evangelism is and what it means to good news. I eventually hooked up with an organization called Youth for Christ, and ended up being a football coach at a high school and just hanging out with kids, all of them completely outside of church. And we just saw hundreds of kids come to faith, a lot of them in our homes with my wife, and they just became a part of our family. And I started to realize, maybe there is something under the hood with Hugh Halter that maybe is a little bit different. I remember I was working with what was called the Luis Palau Association. Luis Palau, even more than Billy Graham, I guess numerically, was prolific in our generation as a worldwide evangelist. And I remember he was from Portland, so he had an organization called the Portland Businessmen's Association. And they were lots of small groups all over downtown Portland where men were gathering other men, and they would generally bring a speaker in and throw some bagels and cream cheese at guys for lunch. And I remember there's 500 guys in an auditorium. Oftentimes Luis would, if he was in town, would come speak to them, and if not, somebody else would. But some of the guys asked me if I would be what they called the close the deal guy. And so that was another kind of, I don't know if it was a prophetic word, but it was something that was spoken over me. And I remember asking him, well, what do you mean by close the deal guy? He said, one of my friends said, there's something about the way that you frame the story of Jesus that is really helpful for guys. And so they would call me downtown. I would actually take a train in and spend a couple days downtown Portland, and I would have meeting after meeting, and guys would just bring their friends, and they were generally men that were leaning into the story of Jesus. And they would go, "Halter, just give them an hour or half an hour." And we saw a lot of men come to faith. And so I guess this is true. Paul's trying to tell Timothy, what were the words that have been spoken over your life? What have your friends said about you? What's your wife consistently say about you? On the positive side, guys, okay? Prophetic words, they're not helpful if you go back to the negative things, but go to the positive ones, where even if you were to ask your friends today, hey, is there anything under my hood that you think would be helpful in the world? If you struggle to even know what a sense of calling is, this week might be a great chance to even sit down. It'll feel a little bit weird, but ask your wife, hey, what do I have that's unique that God seems to use? Or there anything, some of you will say, is there anything positive that you can think of? Not just, because most of the time the world always points out the negative. Even within our marriage relationships, it's like we get that close, and my wife always has been my greatest critic, but she also is my greatest sort of encouragement. So hopefully you have that. But this would be a good week to rally a few friends and go, maybe we'll do that in our group today. Maybe you know each other at least well enough to go, yeah, I think I could speak these things into your life. But we need that, and we also need to remember that. So Paul is saying, hey, I'm about to drop some heavy responsibility on you, but you got to remember who you are and what God's put under the hood of your life, so to speak. Okay? So dive into that. If you've never done any personal assessments, disc profiles, Enneagram, there's all sorts of things that you can do to try to begin to understand who you are. And it's not what you're great at. It's spiritual gifting in the New Testament is not things that you're naturally good at. It's that you actually get supernatural power from God, and that God shows his power through parts of your life that he might not do with somebody else. And so it's never something to be arrogant about or go, oh, I'm an evangelist and you're not. No, there's something that's imparted to each one of us according to Scripture, that God, the Father of lights, gives good gifts to his children. Okay, so God's imparting the essence of who he is, and he promises to impart that to every single person that he's created. So if there are any of you that are going, well, no, there's, Tyler's gifted at teaching, and, but I got, and these other guys are great at hosting, and they seem to be able to draw other men to themselves. And if you go, I just don't know if there's anything there that God can work with. I want to tell you, as the promises of God say, there is. You just have to go find them and have some people speak that into your life. So take it seriously. Now, then it ends. It's actually interesting. And he's telling Timothy, remember the prophecy spoken over you. With this encouragement, use your prophecies as weapons as you wage spiritual warfare. So what's going to come against us as men is this constant voice of don't do anything. It ain't worth it, and you suck. So just stay out of the game. Paul's going, no, remember that stuff. That will be how you fight spiritually. Is you go, no, yeah, there's definitely some things wrong with me, and I'm not, as we say, I'm a little doughy in the middle. I'm still not completely conformed to the image of Jesus, but I do know that God's power is going to work in my life. And that's how you begin to stay true. He says, on the opposite, if you don't keep that in mind, there will be those that reject these virtues and are now destitute of true faith. And then he names two dudes. He just says there's Hymenaeus, we'll call him Jaime, and then there's Alexander. So Jaime and Al are not like you, Timothy, who's going to remember the word spoken, and so you're going to be responsible, and I'm going to be able to raise the bar, and you're going to keep rising to the occasion. These other cats are not like you, okay? They've actually fallen away, okay? A good starting point for all of us in just assessing how we're doing is that we haven't fallen away. We're still leaning in. I often tell this to men. Being a Christian doesn't make you perfect or even better right away. In fact, at the end of your life, you might go, I'm 11% better than I was when I found Christ. Being a Christian doesn't stop the battles. It doesn't mean that you're no longer battle with lust or greed or rage. It just means that you stay in the fight. That's what's unique to a Christian man. Okay? So these guys, they fell away. That's and all of us have fallen away at some point, or we just at least put it in neutral. These are guys that are really falling away. These are guys that must have been in the inner circle. Maybe they were guys, I mean, Paul names them. Paul must have had some time with these guys. So they got the same, it's just like the 12 disciples. Jesus had 12, right? And Judas got the same amount of time as the other 11, but somehow Judas, he got corrupted by finances and money, and so he fell away. It killed him, or he killed himself, essentially. And so here, Hymenaeus and Alexander, sometimes in the Greek, their names actually meant something. Hymenaeus is referred to as some false gods that oftentimes were brought into the Christian community. And people were trying to have a little bit of Jesus, but have a little bit of these other false gods too. And so Timothy probably would have challenged that and went, no, it's just Jesus now. There's no other. Jesus isn't just one of your many. Jesus has to be the Messiah, the main guy, the head. You have to, as I hate to bring a woman in this, but as Carrie Underwood said, Jesus take the wheel. Like you got to let him have everything. He's Alpha, Omega. He's the whole enchilada. There are no other gods that you can bring into the room. He's everything. And so maybe Hymenaeus just couldn't handle that. Alexander, his actual name means man pleaser. Not in the way that some of you just thought, okay? But this idea that he's, Jesus said it this way, Paul said it, if you're trying to please men, you can no longer be a servant of God. There's a natural prophetic word for all of us that the fear of man will stop you from following Jesus. That Jesus doesn't ever want you to worry about what your in-laws think of you or what your peers think of you, coworkers, boss. At some point you go, Jesus is the only one I'm really going to care about. So maybe these two, just every time they were in the room with this burgeoning young community, they just kept pulling the community down or off. And all of a sudden, maybe they got challenged and confronted. They must have stayed in there, though, a little bit, because eventually Paul makes it really hard. You go, man, Paul is mean sometimes. Yeah, he is. Because there's some things that are so painful and hurtful to the Christian community that you just have to call it out. It's kind of a man's man thing. It's you don't just wash over or hope it's going to get better. He says, I've delivered these suckers both over to Satan to be rid of them and to teach them no longer to blaspheme. And so there's a point for all of us. By the way, if you ever wonder, what do you do with guys or people in your lives that just seem to come against you constantly or come against the work of the kingdom? Oftentimes you'll find that they're in the religious circle with you, or they're even in the church, or there are people that they're maybe in your family oftentimes. They just, wherever they're in there, they just muck it up. They just make it harder. It's like you're trying to pull a Clydesdale through the mud every time you're with these people. Well, if that ever happens, don't start with handing them over to Satan. Just maybe write this down. This is how to handle Al and Heine in your life. Number one, just pray. Don't when you're angry at somebody, just go right after them. Stop and pray for a week, a month. Just pray over them. Secondly, if that's not working, go to them just individually, just you and them, and go, hey, I've been struggling. Can we just talk this through as friends or mates? Okay? So go to them personally. Secondly, or third, if that doesn't work and they just kind of keep persisting in driving you nuts, go to them with a couple other brothers and go, hey, we're all having a hard time with this. Can we just bring it up? I tried to bring it up with you. I just felt like this is a big enough deal. I wanted some other guys in the accountability with us. So that's just basic biblical confrontation. I'm sure that Paul had done this with these guys. And if that doesn't work, maybe get the whole group together, get the whole small group, and let's go at it. And because we're heading towards a bad spot, so there's no risk at this point. If something doesn't get fixed, it's going to, as we say, it's going to cause some type of a shipwreck for the community. And if that doesn't happen, the scriptures would even say, then stop associating. If somebody doesn't respond to the Spirit of God. These are people that have some sense of spirituality, okay? This is not what you do with people that don't believe in God. those you just love the heck out of them. But we're talking about people that are inside the ranks that are just making it hard. At some point, there's even a disassociation. You boot them out. And then when that doesn't work because they Facebook you and they slander you all over the city or whatever it is, not that that's ever happened to me, then you hand them over, not even to Satan then, you just give them to God. God, you handle it. You try to fight this battle. And then, number 6, when none of those have worked, you get to where Paul's at, and he just says, hand those sons of guns over to the underworld, the dark side, and let's see if he can have a way, but they're going to be out of our circle. So Paul's given Timothy a little bit of a kick in the rear end here. So this thing, the church of Jesus, is really important. It's worth giving your whole life for. So be responsible, Timothy. Remember the prophecies, the words spoken in your life. Stay true to those. And then these other cats, get them out of there and let's keep moving because we got some serious stuff to get done. So this, to me, this is such a great word, so practical. Hopefully somewhere in there was something for you this morning, and we'll keep moving. But I'll give you some questions related to your own identity, and maybe even some questions related to Al and Heine in your life. So have a good week, guys.